Good afternoon, St. Barnabas. I hope you're all doing well. I wanted to share with you a presentation that I gave back in December, but seems even more pertinent now to our current situation, and that is on the morality of Catholic defense. I wanted to share with you that presentation from the perspective of the Catechism of the Catholic Church, and walk through and hopefully have some discussion at the end on Facebook for what your thoughts are from there. So I'll be mentioning the paragraph numbers from the Catechism as well, but specifically I wanted to talk about those rights and duties we have in the Catechism that are expressed there, and the interaction between our legal system and our moral life that the Church teaches us about, and walk through various principles and how to apply them. This talk is not about gun control for or against, or any specific recommendations or personal advice in that regard, or anything related to defense of equipment. It's not about any hatred of individuals or groups. It's not a criticism of any political movement. And it's not about the morality of war or going over just war principles. Okay, so why does this topic matter? I wanted to share this. It's important to me as a husband and father to walk through this topic in light of my role as husband and father, and to help you navigate that as well. Just to look and see what are our moral and legal duties, our obligations, and during a crisis situation, to have already thought through what would be the best response, in my personal case, to the situation based on the Catechism, based on our faith, to respond. And this is something that you can't just get on the spur of the moment, or at least not to count on that, but to think through ahead of time to see what would be the thing that I would do in particular situations, and to talk about that as a couple, as a family. Regrets follow the unprepared, so overreaction in a defensive situation or underreaction, freezing in place, those things are very common unless we've walked through things as well. So that's what I'd like to help you to do in your particular situation, just to give that moral framework and legal framework. This is not legal advice, but I am posting some things that are from the federal government as well as the state of North Carolina for you to be able to look and see what the law is, and then hopefully you can apply that well. But again, this is not legal advice. So is there a difference between self-defense and murder? The Catechism speaks directly to that in 2263. The legitimate defense of persons and societies is not an exception to the prohibition against the murder of the innocent that constitutes intentional killing. The act of self-defense can have a double effect: the preservation of one's own life and the killing of the aggressor. The one is intended, the other is not. And that's really the key there. If there is something that is done intentionally to someone to harm them, that is always immoral, whether that's severe physical harm or even death. Either one is immoral if it's intended. The intention should be to stop the aggressor. So we'd actually be committing grave sin if we intended or desired the death or harm of another. Paragraph 2264, Part A. Love towards oneself remains a fundamental principle of morality. Therefore, it is legitimate to insist on respect for one's own right to life. Someone who defends his life is not guilty of murder, even if he is forced to deal his aggressor a lethal blow. So again, that would not be desired, but to deal a lethal blow, that would not be moral. Someone hoping for that would be being immoral, gravely so. But love of oneself, in a healthy sense, it's not being selfish. There's the principle of subsidiarity that the Catholic Church draws on. You can read about in many encyclicals, by starting with Pope Leo XIII that I'm aware of, where you look at what is the lowest level of authority that can solve a problem, whatever that is. And that is the preferred level of authority to take care of something. So when it comes to care of oneself, it's preferable for oneself to do that through eating well, through taking the proper medications when it's necessary, sleeping well, etc. when that's not being done, then others do that for us. So that's the principle of subsidiarity. So at the most fundamental level, we all have the moral obligation to take care of ourselves first. And that's not being selfish, but it's taking care of, at the lowest, most local level, what God has given us. And that's where this principle of morality of caring for oneself in a defensive situation comes into play. The goal is to preserve one's life, again, not to cause harm, not to take a life. Part B of that paragraph, 2264b. If a man in self-defense uses more than necessary violence, it will be unlawful, meaning immoral. Whereas if he repels force with moderation, his defense will be lawful. Nor is it necessary for salvation that a man omit the act of moderate self-defense to avoid killing the other man, since one is bound to take more care of one's own life than of another's. So there it is very clearly, and I think this could be a surprise or a shock to some people about that, being in the Catechism in this very clear manner, about one is bound to take care more of one's own life than another's. But there's definitely a degree of reason in here too, that one doesn't fly into a self-defensive situation going overboard and using lethal force when it's not called for. There's moderation in that, which is very good. So but it's not necessary for salvation that we omit an act of moderate self-defense, something that's fitting to the situation, even if it causes someone else ultimately to die as a result of that, unfortunately. So an example would be of proportionate means of defending life. If you or someone that you know in your vicinity, some family member, is in immediate threat of death or serious bodily harm, then using a potentially lethal defense would be morally justified. However, if someone is just throwing a punch out of anger at you or a loved one, it likely in most situations would not be life-threatening or causing serious harm, and therefore using a more mild, less lethal defense would be what would be moral, what would be called for in that situation. 2265. Legitimate defense can be not only a right, but a grave duty for someone responsible for another's life. Preserving the common good requires rendering the unjust aggressor unable to inflict harm. To this end, those holding legitimate authority have the right to repel by armed force aggressors against the civil community entrusted to their charge. Okay, so there's a lot in this paragraph. Not only a right, but a grave duty. Whenever the Catechism uses that term grave duty, it really is a big deal. They don't use that lightly. And so if someone is responsible for another's life, there's a grave duty to protect them when they come under threat. But preserving the common good requires that. We make an aggressor unable to continue his or her acts of aggression. It's an issue of justice. So those who are in legitimate authority, what does that mean? It refers to police officers and the military, etc., but again, with the principle of subsidiarity, looking at that most local fundamental level, it also applies to anybody who has any authority over another, anyone in a family situation, a parent, for their children, for their spouse. There is an obligation to care for those people, including to prevent harm from being done to them, to the best of our ability. And it would be, therefore, a failure of duty. It would be morally wrong. It would be sinful to, out of fear or out of a lack of preparation, to not deal with that situation to the best of one's ability. However, an adult can choose to forego this right to defense if you've thought about it beforehand, and you say, I don't want to risk doing anyone any lethal blow. I can forego that right. But you cannot make that call for someone else, and some people do not have the ability to make that rational choice. Children would be an example, or an aged parent who has dementia would be examples. They cannot make the choice to forego the right to self-defense. So one must, if necessary, use physical defense, even potentially lethal defense, to defend someone in that situation if there is no other means that is reasonable for doing so. So can't I just call the police? Yes, of course, do call the police. Our police have a very important role in the defense of the common good in our society. They deserve our cooperation and our respect. And we need their help and services as well. So, but in the meantime, what are we as the most local authority in our home to do if we are faced with a deadly encounter, potentially deadly encounter? We cannot pass our duties and our rights on to someone else when there is something in the moment that needs our attention. There's that saying, when seconds count, the police are only minutes away. And I think it's very true to look at that and think about that. Another analogy that might be helpful is with fire extinguishers. Fire extinguishers aren't obsolete just because of the fire department, and neither is you're taking self-defensive measures when there's a police department. They work together. There's not a one or the other. It makes sense. So the Catechism on Community Defense, paragraph 1909. Finally, the common good requires peace, that is, the stability and security of a just order. It presupposes that authority should ensure by morally acceptable means the security of society and its members. It is the basis of the right to legitimate personal and collective defense. Okay, so this paragraph is just unpacking this right to self-defense, the right to security and peace that we all require. In order for us to have a society, we have to have some semblance of law and order. We have to have rules and guidelines in place to help to guide us in our weak human nature towards what is good and away from what is evil. And that's what our legal system is designed to do, what our police officers are trained to do. But when that is not working as well as it should, communities have the right to also come together to defend themselves in their local area. Think about it during Hurricane Katrina when there was rioting or looting, or in some of the situation now with the riots going on. People in communities who are protecting their community from being looted or from being destroyed or harmed in some way, just protecting their neighborhood. That certainly is a right of a community to do so. I think it's also very important to keep in mind that when we're dealing with defending ourselves or our family, that this is a spiritual battle as well as a physical one, even more than a physical one. When we are under attack by someone, there is temptation, there's sin involved on the part of the person attacking us. But they're really not the enemy. Ultimately, our enemy is always spiritual, not flesh and blood. And I think it's important to remember that so we don't give in to hate. Whenever we hate someone, that is morally wrong, regardless of what they've done to us. We shouldn't be eager for a fight or eager to prove anything to anyone, but rather we're trying to stop harm. And it's very difficult to keep one's heart out of that, but it's important to think through that ahead of time, I believe, and to make sure that we are entrusting ourselves to God, that we don't give in to hate, but that we are, whatever we have to do for our family, we're doing out of love, not only for our family, but for everyone else in society, including the aggressor, wanting what's best for them spiritually and physically, wanting what's best.